how of the nearly 70 countries that have made the transition from dictatorship to varying degrees of democracy in the previous 35 years, only a small minority did so through armed struggle from below or reform instigated from above. Hardly any resulted from a foreign invasion. In nearly 3/4 of the transitions, changes rooted in democratic civil society organizations that employed nonviolent methods. Similarly, in the highly acclaimed book, Why Civil Resistance Works, authors Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan, who are decidedly mainstream, quantitative-oriented strategic analysts, they noted how the nearly 350 major insurrections in support of self-determination and democratic rule over the past century, primarily violent resistance, was successful only 26% of the time, whereas primarily non-violent campaigns had a 53% rate of success, more than twice as much. Similarly, they have noted that successful armed struggles take an average of 8 years, while successful unarmed struggles have taken an average of 2 years. Even more significantly, the majority of these successful nonviolent struggles were able to create stable democracies, whereas only 10% of the armed struggles resulted in stable democracies. They tended to fall into either a new dictatorship or civil war. Nonviolent action, and this is relevant to think about, has also been a powerful tool in reversing coups d'etats. In Bolivia in 1979, in Argentina in 1986, in Haiti in 1990, in Russia in 1991, and in Burkina Faso in 2015, coups have been reversed when the plotters realized that, after people took to the streets, that physically controlling key buildings and institutions did not mean they actually had power. Indeed, if there is one piece of advice I would like to offer you, is that the Sudanese people organize and plan now for the possibility of widespread civil resistance, which you could implement in the event of an attempted coup, such as having plans for underground radio stations and other forms of communication, plans for people to block key bridges and roads, occupy buildings, and encourage defections from security forces. You know, just as militaries have contingency plans in case of an emergency, so should ordinary people. Governments are only as strong as people's willingness to obey. The people of Sudan brought down Bashir and brought democratic civilians to power because they refused to recognize the legitimacy of illegitimate rule. Indeed, if you want to see what kind of people are the most powerful political actors in the world today, look into the mirror. It is people like you. And we have seen here in Sudan and in countries around the world, the more involved women are in struggles for freedom and justice, the more likely they are to succeed. If people are united and recognize their power, all the guns and tanks in the world cannot stop them. On some level, many young people today recognize this already. One of the biggest differences I've noticed when I first visited the Middle East and North Africa in the 1980s and when I visit here today is that I used to always get asked questions, well, what does the United States think about this? What does the United States think about that? I rarely get that question anymore, because more and more people, especially younger people, don't really care what the United States and other outside powers think. That sense of fatalism that had permeated generations of Arabs and Africans, many of whom had long resigned themselves to simply being the pawns of foreign powers, their own autocratic rulers, that's disappearing. Popular nonviolent insurrections, such as what took place here in Sudan, have dramatically challenged this sense of victimhood, exposing that the state does not have power if people refuse to recognize that power. Now, this is not to say that foreign governments don't have impact. When the United States or Russia, Britain, France, and other countries provide military aid and other security assistance to dictatorial regimes and occupation forces, it increases the repressive capacity of the state to suppress struggles for freedom and justice. Similarly, military actions by foreign powers can end up strengthening repressive regimes. Trump's attacks on Iran this past week have weakened the ongoing freedom and justice struggles in both Iran and Iraq as people rally around the flag in face of foreign aggression. Similarly, here in Sudan in 1998, the U.S. bombing of the Al-Shifa pharmaceutical plant in Khartoum North weakened the pro-democracy struggle in that country and united people in support of the regime against the American assault. Ultimately, however, the power is in your hands. You must not allow oppressors, whether they be foreign imperialists or reactionary forces, militaristic forces here in Sudan, stop you from fulfilling the vision of a just and free Sudan. Your remarkable levels of popular mobilization, civil engagement, and persistence against such adversity demonstrated by the people of Sudan gives me hope that democracy and its benefits will prevail against those forces, both foreign and domestic, which want to usurp it, inshallah. So once again, it has surely been an honor to be able to speak before you today.
Questions?
هنا Thank you, Mr. Stephen Dons, for this comprehensive lecture about the uprising of Sudan. Despite of what all you said, and the international recognition for this unique uprising, how can you explain the decline of most of the European countries or possibly America and others to provide assistance for this regime, which inherited an almost completely devastating economic and infrastructure and whatever. In view of the existence, the still existence of the deep state here, and one expects, those who are talking about human rights and supporting democracy and so on, to support this regime, still. Thank you.
It's very unfortunate and perplexing. There's a tendency, I think, for Western governments to go to great efforts and great expense to challenge governments that we don't like, but we are unwilling to put in the kind of resources to support democratic governance, to try to encourage sustainable kinds of development. I think it is part of this kind of bias we have towards Arab and African countries. I think part of it is the bias that doesn't trust the ability of self-governance, this idea, oh, you need a strong man to keep people in line. You know, there's this very condescending, in fact, I'd argue racist attitude that we often see in the West. But you know, there's also the economic interests. You know, that dictatorships can offer economic concessions. They can buy armaments. They can. They're more likely to pursue policies that that benefit certain outside interests. Democratic governments, by their nature, want to put their country first. And putting their country first doesn't necessarily mean supporting the agenda of foreign corporations or foreign governments. And I think it's particularly shameful that the United States is insisting that the democratic government end up paying compensation for crimes committed by the Bashir regime. Unfortunately, that is not new. I mean, to this very day, South Africa spends close to 20% of its annual budget paying interest on debts that were accumulated by the apartheid, the white minority government. And then similarly, there have been other new democracies around the world that have been forced to, pay the IMF or other international banks, money that was essentially stolen by the former dictatorships. So unfortunately, what is happening in terms of Sudan and the continued sanctions and the lack of more direct support is not unusual. And so here's the problem, because the struggle that pro-democracy forces have in Africa and the Middle East and other parts of the global South is not just against authoritarian elements within your own country. It's a struggle against an international economic system and political system that is frankly dominated by imperialist interest, that does not recognize the true rights of self-determination. And self-determination does not simply mean having your own flag and a seat at the United Nations. Self-determination involves being able to develop your country the way you want it developed, not the way that bankers in New York and London and Zurich and elsewhere want the country to do so. And again, we're seeing a global movement that has arisen in recent decades that are making the links between injustice at home and the injustice in the international system. And they're challenging archaic things. I mean, for example, what the young people in Lebanon and Iraq, challenging the ethnic and sectarian divisions that were imposed from the outside by the French in the case of Lebanon, by the United States in the case of Iraq. They're saying we don't want the kind of divisions that outsiders have imposed on us, and so and we don't want the old generation of politicians that collaborated with it. So again, I recognize that this is a very difficult struggle that goes beyond Sudan, but I think the same kinds of courage and resilience that the Sudanese demonstrated in the revolution could be applied to these broader questions as well.
Any more questions or comments? Yes, please. Please make it short and precise.
Okay, you mentioned earlier that then proved that brutally totalitarian regimes can be brought down without violence. But is it possible that lack of violence in the Sudanese revolution was not necessarily a strategy, but because Sudan is a developing country and civilians don't necessarily have that much access to firepower?
Well, there's still a lot of guns in this country, and especially in the rural areas. I think if people wanted to move, and there's also, of course, a black market in weapons, just as there are in other contraband. You know, it's just a short hop across the Red Sea from Yemen, you know, where there are more guns per capita than almost any country in the world. You know, so and not to mention, you know, some corrupt elements in the military. I really do think people could have gotten weapons if they wanted to. But I think that in fact, you know, the main reason I'm actually here in Sudan is that I'm interviewing people who, some of the leaders in the revolution, and every one of them has told me that it was a very conscious decision to use nonviolent means, simply because it was so effective. In fact, the regime actually tried to infiltrate the protests to provoke violence, to give the regime an excuse to crack down even more. And it was very impressive the way that, for example, in the massive sit-ins in front of the military headquarters, protesters created barricades, and they actually searched people. They wanted to make sure there were no weapons, or even anything that could be used as a weapon. I mean, they even took away, you know, cosmetic mirrors that women had in their purses, because they didn't want them to throw them at people. And you know, so it's a very conscious decision. I think a very wise one.
Academic lecture that you given us today. And in fact, I don't have a question. Actually, I have a comment. Our time that you talked about the brilliance of the Sudanese revolution as if it's an outstanding event by itself. I'm from the old school of thinking that there is a continuation of human experience, starting all the way from the Renaissance or the Enlightenment age, and probably going from even earlier, into all the way to Huntington and Francisco Kuyama, passing to Hobbes and so on. So if we try to project the Sudanese revolution as an event of itself, we would probably reach your conclusion that the West has always, the Western thinking has always had its reservation. These countries or these regions are not capable of endorsing democracy as an application, not as a theory. So, in order to guarantee, I mean, revolutions don't not endorse to erupt or to cause change. They are the culmination of so many factors that create such situation for a revolution. Sudanese revolutions have this very characteristic non-violent nature, but it remains to be the fact that the revolution ends up at some point, at some stage, where there is a government, there is the executive government, there is the takeover. Then becomes the question of the international community. How can reassuring or establishing such change in remote areas, what we call remote areas of third world countries or least developed countries, How can they help in that to ensure that democracy prevails as Fukuyama? Thank you.
I really think a lot of evolution, one that did not start in the December of 2018 and end in August of this past year, that it is still more people mobilize, the greater, their pressure to move it forward. And internationally, I mean, on one hand, it's a tragedy that under 30 years of al-Bashir's rule, that so many of Sudan's brightest and most capable ended up leaving. I mean, the Sudanese diaspora is 5 million people now or something? It's very, very large. But the good thing about that is you have a lot of very smart, well-connected people, some of whom have made money, a fair amount of money and the like, who still care deeply about Sudan. And I'm sure you all have seen either relatives or friends who've been coming back after years away or support this, and they can not only support in terms of their own expertise and skill for the revolution. In the United States, for example, there are a handful of members of Congress who have supported the Sudanese was because they had constituents, Sudanese Americans, who talked to them and convinced them that this was an important I think international solidarity is very, very important. International solidarity is critical in bringing down apartheid in South Africa. It's a major Palestine solidarity movement. But I think there needs to be international solidarity for countries in transition, such as Sudan, and that's one thing that you go back to the United States and encourage that.
Morning, about the economic punishments. That these punishments are applied because the human rights and democracy. So the United States are punishing these citizens and state that they're supporting the revolution.
Sorry, what punishment you heard?
Economic punishments.
Yeah. Listing its legal process and the into Trump is for the Iran. There are bureaucratic in the way. There are racist and Islamophobic elements in the U.S. government party, and problem, and this is again why I'm here, is to be bond solidarity. spending oppressive regime elsewhere on this very irrational. That's this concern.
Attended one is, but I'd rather repeat it. Does the international event Thank you very much.
They contradict a democracy, a major global power, which tend to dominate, and those in power, see these narrowly defined the United Islam. Many people believe in, but then use it to and the United States less safe and less secure. And democratic institutions, but people here in the Middle East and Africa, they don't see things in tear gas canisters. They the Arab dictatorships, U.S. support for the Israeli occupation. It's